We'll continue as we have. Who would like to lead us this evening in the Lord's Prayer?
I mean, I'll do it.
Okay.
I'm in. Yeah,
Yep.
I'm in. We want to go up there and do it? Or what?
Sure.
All right. I don't know. You got it written down somewhere?
Yeah, it's right there on the board. It's also,
All right.
you can look here.
Let's see here. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you. All right, so we are picking up where we ended last time, because there is still a little bit more. So it's going to seem like we're jumping over all over the place this week, just because we have to finish up what we were talking about last week, which was the yearly church and kind of the European understanding of the church and the state. And of course, it's the boring stuff, but in most people's standards. But then we're going to jump past what we talked about 2 weeks ago, which is the American history, and pick up in the U.S. Civil War. So last week we stopped at the end of the Reformation. I do not quite remember exactly what point I was on when we ended, other than Martin Luther kind of kicks us all off with the Reformation, because he's saying the Pope has overstepped his bounds. The Pope's not supposed to be acting like a king. If anything, he should be more of a leader of the church, which is not waging taxes, building palaces while the poor people starve in the streets, and raising armies. That's another point we talked about last week with the Crusades. And so through all of it, what we get is the Pope is trying to flex his power and say he has authority over the Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, which I do now remember I mentioned is not Holy Roman or an empire. But it was one of those, the Pope was saying, yeah, I have the authority to do this because I'm the head of the church. And Martin Luther is kind of saying, no, you don't. That's not what you should be doing. You're taking the spot where God is and not allowing God to be the leader. You don't have that authority. And then, of course, we get the Lutheran Church is the denomination that kind of splits off directly from it. That's why they bear his name, Luther. And then becomes popular with the German princes. After that, or around the same time, we get John Calvin, who's in Switzerland. Like Martin Luther, he's pushing for a different political order. And he doesn't like how far-reaching the church is in the daily life. It's one of those, there's good things that the church and its governing can do, but that's not what the Catholics are doing. They're being more like an extra king that we have to pay taxes to, instead of letting us take care of the poor, create charitable organizations, and affect real social change. So Calvin had come to recognize there was a rot in the morality of the Pope, and he sought to establish a movement that's focused more on a moral community government or governance, instead of just this, there's the church and then there's the state, or the church can dictate to the emperor, and so he has to act like the emperor. And then we get to, I think, probably the one that everyone knows a little bit better, or at least the song of, at least the Horrible Histories song of, and that's King Henry VIII. He gets to be considered a reformer because he wanted a divorce. And so, unlike the other two who are trying to, not necessarily, some could argue that they weren't good reasons, but more noble reasons than King Henry VIII. Henry VIII did not like the wife he had to marry. I say had to marry because he inherited getting to marry the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon because of Arthur's death. His older brother died, and so, instead of rewriting the treaty, the younger brother will inherit the responsibility of Arthur, and his responsibility was marrying Catherine. Catherine's the mother of Queen Mary, who will become one of the agitators of the Puritans in a couple, not necessarily centuries, but a couple decades after Henry VIII. And Henry VIII wants a divorce, but he's still a Catholic, and so he has to ask the Pope for a divorce, because it's not like the Pope wasn't allowing a divorce. It was just certain things had to be worked out, and thinking that it would all work out, King Henry VIII asked for a divorce. And the Pope says, absolutely not. You cannot get a divorce from the Spanish princess because the Spaniards are better Catholics than the English. And King Henry VIII basically said, you're right. We're no longer Catholic, and we are now English Christians or Anglicans. And I'm the head of that church, and I can grant myself my own divorce. And so he grants himself a divorce. This leads to some interchanging of land and property because, well, we're kicking all the Catholics out of the churches and we're seizing them for the crown. And the crown's going to then appoint who the priests are in these churches. And, well, usually if you weren't in the Catholic leadership as a priest, that was because you weren't seeking to become a priest, or there was something clearly wrong with how you thought of the church. And so so you're starting to see that there's these not classically trained individuals becoming leaders in churches, and that kind of doubles down on some of the issues. That then leads to the Puritans. The Puritans are saying, wow, all this crazy change, what if we just got back to being good at doing church? And what if we stopped doing these sinful activities and we purified the Church of England? And that sounds great until you start to realize what they're starting to argue for is a lot more of, I guess not necessarily argue for, but once they finally get the power that they wanted, they start persecuting everyone that was persecuting them. They use their tactics to get revenge. They really didn't like the governance of the Catholic monarchs of Mary and Charles, and yet when Oliver Cromwell, who was a Protestant, becomes Lord Protector, aka he took the king's throne but didn't say he was king, he then punished all the Catholics and tried to push them out of Scotland and Ireland. And so they also claimed that the Church of England was too Catholic for them. But then once you get Catholic and Anglican priests back into, or monarchs back into control, with Charles II being reinstated, what happens is, well, now we have to kick all the Protestants, all the Puritans out, and all the Puritans then decide, let's move to Massachusetts, and start our colony there. And that's where we picked the first week with the U.S. history. And now we're picking back up with the U.S. history, with the U.S. Civil War and the Churches of Christ. I wanted to stop here after that first week because the Civil War, though there's some who want to say, no, the Churches of Christ had nothing to do with the Civil War. It had no impact on us. Well, it's great and all, except for you emerge as a denomination or as a group 40 years before the Civil War. So your oldest members have not died yet when the Civil War starts. All of you are impacted by it because now you have this whole new generation shortly after the Civil War that are shaping all of their opinions and ideas about how the church should function, with the Civil War being that defining moment in their history. And so we'll pick it up slightly before. The Restoration movement, which we are a part of, really focuses on two guys, Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. Alexander Campbell was born in Ireland. He was born in Ireland, went to school in Scotland, moved back to Ireland, got in trouble with the church because he said things like, hey, let's not judge people too harshly and let them accept communion without having to judge them for, hey, you haven't gone to confession this month yet, you can't take communion yet. Hey, let's just let them have communion because they're a member of the church. And of course, they're like, no, that doesn't work. You need to find a new church. And so Alexander Campbell moves in his young adult life to the United States, originally starting in the Pennsylvania area. He moves to what at the time was considered Virginia, but it's West Virginia now. And then, so that's where he's ministering. He's not really fitting into one of those denominational boxes. It seems to be whatever church will hire him or let him preach is the church he's at. What he's always striving for, there needs to be a church that isn't so concerned with the rights and wrongs and how many times you do things, and they're not trying to be so transactional with the body and blood of Christ. There needs to be an openness to the communion. God is actively calling people to his table at communion. We should not get in God's way of inviting people to the table. Barton Stone is from Missouri. He's kind of having similar ideas. He's desiring a more primitive Christianity. He coins this phrase. It doesn't mean be all willy-nilly. It's it'd be really nice if we didn't need a certain type of building or a certain type of training or a certain type of this or that. What if we could just have a place where people met, they heard someone read the Bible, we sang some songs, and we had the Lord's Supper? Why do we need to do we have to ring a certain bell at certain times? Let's get rid of all of that. Let's just have church be church. And his big, I guess, point outside of this is this idea of what does it mean to be a Christian who is free? What does freedom as a Christian look like? I know we've kind of hit on this on Sunday mornings a couple months ago. I guess it's not a couple months ago. It was like back in January when we were going through Galatians. Paul is teaching this idea of you have been set free from your sins because of the death of Christ. Well, Barton Stone's hearing that and he's thinking, but what does that mean when we're in a country that is guaranteeing rights and freedoms? Is anything that the government say is right and we're free to do the same thing that Paul is saying Christians are right and free to do? And so he kind of wrestles with this for a bit, but what ends up happening is there's this it's the Cane Ridge Revival. It's in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. And what happens is these Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, but it's a wider sentiment because you have all these frontier churches that are close to absolutely no one, and they're sitting here thinking, wouldn't it be really great if we could just get a bunch of people together? And we stopped focusing on this or that or arguing over these differences. What if we just got people out together and we had a revival to where we could all just spend time worshiping God together? Recently in one of my classes talking about this subject, someone compared it to the Asbury revival that happened in Kentucky. Is that 2 years ago now? But it was kind of something similar. It wasn't as well organized, but it was a bunch of college students who basically just said, we want to have a time, or this is the Asbury revival, we want to have a time where we can focus on God. And it was so good that it just kept going on and on and on. Well, this is something similar here. It's a bunch of people from these small country churches that have come in from all over the place because someone said in a meeting and said, we're going to get together, we're going to worship God. And for those who haven't had a chance in a while to have a communion service, we will provide communion to you. It's one of those things that I always find weird because I feel like we were pretty consistent on, yeah, we have communion every Sunday. But for large parts of church history, that wasn't the thing. Sure, priests would have communion every Sunday. Sure, there would be some groups that would have communion every Sunday. But as I sat there and thought about it, Joe Schmo, who's living on a plantation miles away from the nearest town, let alone the nearest church, he's not having communion every Sunday. Unless he's carving out half of his week to travel into town. But then he has to carve out another half of the week to go back out of town. And so it's one of those, this moment is significant because we're starting to see kind of, well, even our foundations of what we do on Sunday mornings start to emerge. We're focusing on reading the Bible. We're focusing on communion services. We're focusing on having a message read to us. And so this movement starts, and Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone do get in a little bit of a trouble because they intentionally tried to remove the barriers that other groups would say. When they go back to their jobs, I believe Alexander Campbell at the time was working for a Methodist church. And once the Methodists hear you served how many people communion and you didn't check if they were baptized and you didn't check how many times they had gone to church and you didn't check these things, well, we can't have you be our minister anymore. You have to go and leave. And Barton Stone experienced something similar in Missouri, but realizing after this moment that there's people who want to just have a church that is simplistic, that isn't focused on how many times you say a Hail Mary or you do genuflex or anything like that. They decide to start and form their own church or churches, and it will become the movement that is the Church of Christ. Yeah, I basically just said that. Because it's also one of those, another defining piece is we're not bound by a higher church authority. With the Catholics, you have the Pope and the bishops and the cardinals and the vicars, and like we could run down all the fancy names of the leaders. That then you get to the priests that would actually be in your town. And it's one of those when you had a small question or a question that the priest couldn't answer, it would take months or if not years because they had to send the message off and it would go to the next guy. And it would then go to the next guy and he would sit there, and if he didn't know the answer, it would go to the guy ahead of him. And eventually, if it became a big enough problem, they rallied everyone together and had the Pope weigh in. And the Pope often did not know what was going on either. And so it was one of those, it would take forever just to get back to the original church and the original congregate to say, yeah, the Pope has no idea what's going on with X, Y, or Z. And so there's that problem, but it's also one of those, what does a leader who lives in central Italy know anything about West Texas? How can he lead, if we were Catholic, right? And we had a problem. And we had to eventually listen, and we had to listen to the Pope, who lives in central Italy and has really nice clothes and gets to basically walk around like a king. How can he relate and how can he understand the impacts of some of his decisions that happen to us and our lives? They can't, right? And so what was starting to happen at this time in the middle 1800s is which the Methodists don't really have a Pope-like figure. It's a guy who, I think the current one, I guess there's a split, so looking at the Methodists won't probably help. But there's what we have going on is instead churches are organized and led by people inside their congregation. It's organized by elders and deacons that the congregation knows. We all know, or should know, all the elders that we have here at Greenlawn, right? We may not know all the deacons because it seems like some people were named deacons 20 years ago and some were just now named, but no one knows either group. And sorry, that's a side that you guys didn't necessarily need to know, but you may have agreed that, oh, I didn't know Jared was the deacon of AV. He is, but we all know our elders, and I would say we have their pictures on the wall, but I noticed today that they're no longer on the wall, probably because they're putting new pictures up. But it's one of those, we know Bill, we know Randy, we know Gary, and we have those elders. Kelly was an elder. We know who those individuals are, and we have that relationship with them inside the congregation. So they're all getting to this idea of a simplified church. However, in 1860, we get a pretty contentious election. If you thought our two candidates that we have this year were a lot. Try having 4 candidates, and they're all saying very different things. I do think it's weird. In high school, they're always like, it was Abraham Lincoln and I just won't blank on his name, Douglas. Last name Douglas. I want to say it's Stephen Douglas. And like they were the two that really had this. Well, they were the 2 main nominees. Douglas came in like dead last. He won 1 state, and so it's just one of those. And it's building up for years, because what you have is in 1857 you have the Dred Scott decision, which basically says if you're African American, the U.S. Constitution does not apply to you. And this was a decision made by the Supreme Court. But it's one of those, well, the churches are impacted by this because, well, the churches are not diverse. It is, you have your white churches, and then you have, no one cares about those people because they're not people under the U.S. Constitution. Right? They are property. They are less than, even if they were free, they are less than human in the eyes of the law. And then you have all of the debates surrounding slavery. What states can decide to be free or slave states? What are we going to do with these newer Western states? And what you start to also see is it's already starting to boil over in territories like Kansas and Nebraska. And it's termed bleeding Kansas, but it's because Kansas decides we will let our people vote and decide on what Kansas will be. Will we be a free state? Will we be a slave state? Well, it doesn't take long for those who are pro-slavery to put out the word that, hey, there's going to be a vote. We need to get as many people to show up to elections, whether they're from Kansas or not, to come vote in this election in the state of Kansas. And then the union and free states start to hear this and they say, absolutely not, we need to fill it with anti-slavery voters. Well, they all bring their guns and they all they may have started pretty small, it may have been a scrap in the streets or in a bar or a hotel or maybe, and then someone pulled out a gun and started shooting the other side. Well, there are churches in Kansas that had to deal with this issue. There's churches in the southern states and the northern states that had to deal with this issue. And I want us to we'll spend 5 minutes. Maybe that's too much time. I don't know. But I want you guys to get with the people you're sitting around and discuss, should the church get involved with politics when moral issues are on the ballot? You have 5 minutes. Jay, you're going to have to go find someone.
I don't get involved in politics.
You're in a weird class.
You're here.
I don't know what conversation.
You're no longer you're not here to state.
Well, I think one of the big moral issues back then was slavery, and yes, I think the churches should be involved because it was so I do think that it's kind of, abortion is similar to slavery, because a lot of people say, well, I don't agree with abortion, but I shouldn't keep someone else from doing that. A lot of Christians back then would say, well, I don't agree with slavery, but I shouldn't keep someone else from having a slave. So they would do.
I'll say they're already.
Okay. Yeah, the separation of the state and the church comes down to, my government is supposed to protect my borders. The government is supposed to, protect our rights to be who we wanna be and whether we like it or not. And the government is supposed to protect us. They don't have to protect my moral issues.
We have a responsibility as Christians to stand up for the word of God. If there's people in the world that are not standing on the word of God, we need to stand up for the church. Like we allow in this way, I'm not sure it's like America, but in England it's like they're taking God out of schools. There's a lot of things that it's like the church and doctrine. It's like, why didn't our own not writing violently, but why we stood up? Why we allow God to protect us? Why we allow persecutions? We're part of it. We sit back and just allow things to happen. That's why it's the right thing.
Well, if you don't stand up, you're allowing them to harm you. So if you never stand up, football game or anything, you're gonna
On behalf of the church, like to take this is the right thing. The same with the ballot referendum. And then if you did
Oh, just with more.
If you want to extend it further, that's fine.
The parameters kind of moral issues, I'm not sure what's the moral issues that are going on. Abortion,
back to this day,
abortion. The people are trying to legalize abortion. Banning abortion.
Roe versus Wade, you know what that is? Roe versus Wade? Okay, that was.
All right, let's go ahead and bring us back together.
Basically, it's the same. Yeah, it used to be.
You got this mess going, so it's
I did get this mess started, Jack. Who wants to be bold enough to share what you guys talked about?
Brainstorm.
If not, we can just keep listening to me lecture and that'll be fine too.
But tell them like it is.
I'm not so sure that it's okay to say that the church or any church ought to get involved and make it a drive in their worship, in their service to God, to take this on, because I don't think that that's what necessarily God wants us to do. But I think God does want us to be, as Christians, active in service, I think even in the government. PTA groups, city councils and stuff, and then all the way up, because if Christians are not involved and supporting Christians that uphold Christian values and morals in this country, then you're leaving it up to the other side who don't care about God's morals and will not support them, most likely because they don't even know what they are. They have an agenda, and if the Christians they would have an agenda too if they wanted to promote God's peace on this world and in this country, and the values that are important to God. I think we have a responsibility to support those. And in this election, you mentioned that it's greatly divided. Neither one of them are perfect. None of us are perfect, but they are certainly not perfect. But which of these candidates has the closest support for the things that are important to God, like protecting unborn lives, having a border and having it protected, have an economy that supports the people and supports those that need help. And those are things that Christians are supposed to do. And so it basically comes down to you're voting for the lesser of two evils. But you gotta vote, because if you don't vote, you're sure giving the other side that is supporting the worst of the two against all the things that God stands for. And so if you don't do your part, you leave it up to the other individuals to do, and they'll do their part. Did I step out of line?
I'd say I'll just give it to God.
I know one thing is people give, men and women, women want rights. And I think that there's so much women power that it's just not right. And nobody's saying nothing about it. But I just think that you put men down, they're so powerful, and I just think there ought to be something done. And also too, the image of God that made man and woman is not that way anymore. There's people that want the rights to be a woman, to be a man, and a man to be a woman. That bothers me. But it's so much of that our children are becoming to think that way. And I don't like that. I just don't think it's right with God.
I think America's come a long way. We've already fought those battles.
Sure.
I think we've already fought those battles, and we're starting to go backwards and pick them apart. But I can sit with anyone. I can visit with anybody. I'm not their judge. But if they ask me, they want to know, I tell them why I feel this way. But I think these battles have already been fought. We got bigger fish to fry now.
Yeah. Speaking of battles, we have to talk about the Civil War, because it is one of those turning points. It's one of those turning points in American history. It's always one of those. We have to also be reminded of how devastating this was, not only to the United States. It's all the United States. About 1,125,000 Americans from the North and from the South died in the Civil War. It breaks down about 600. Let's just say 650. 650,000 from the Union. About 500,000 from the Confederate, which, depending on your counts, because the Confederates were not good at truly keeping count of who was in what battle or where they were. It's almost a third, but some counts say it's over half of the Confederate soldiers die in the Civil War. The United States has come out and said, for both sides and all the destruction that happened, according to modern inflation standards, about $5.2 billion of damages were done. And it's one of those, you had southern cities that were absolutely destroyed, railroads were torn up, crops burned, and that was a part of the Union General Sherman's campaign in, not Atlanta, but yes, Atlanta, but that's not the state, Georgia and South Carolina. It does have some unique impacts on churches, specifically small churches and southern churches, who were the small southern churches in this time? It was the churches of Christ. Why? Because all of the men either were off in the war, died in the war, or no longer have money because their property has been taken from them. Because not everyone owned a plantation, but if you lost your farm, well, now you don't have a way of making money. And so these small southern churches, they have to start consolidating around big areas. Your Nashvilles, your Memphises, I guess in some extent, Searcy, Arkansas, your Richmonds, your Montgomerys, your Atlantas. And so it's one of those, you start to have these larger pockets of churches of Christ than other places emerge. And then there's also your black churches. Because after the Civil War, of course, you have 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution that says well, you can't own slavery, not own slavery, own slaves, and there's no person based on their color can be considered not someone deserving of rights under the U.S. Constitution. That doesn't mean they can necessarily hang out with white people, but they can have their church over here, and we will meet over on this side of town, and we will have our church over here. And so you start to see a growing number of churches that of course are segregated for the time, but it's interesting, the churches of Christ that have more of the black heritage seem to be doing a lot better now than those that have their roots all the way back into, well, we were the white church in 1867 or whatever. And it's just an interesting pattern. But a couple years later, David Lipscomb comes onto this, well, I guess not a couple years. He's 30 when the Civil War breaks out. But he starts making a name for himself as he grows older. He lives in Tennessee, and he sees the horrors of the Civil War, and what he decides, maybe contrary to what we had our discussion about, he says Christians should not vote. Christians should be independent from the government, and they should not get involved in the social and political matters of the day. Our job as Christians, as members of the Church of Christ, is to not ever be in a situation like that. And how do we do that? Is by being completely separated from those who started the Civil War, those politicians, those evil people over there. We're not going to get involved. Okay, well, it's not just the politicians. You have to elect politicians. And so if we weren't involved in elections, how are we going to stop people who want to divide the country and who want to support evils like slavery from running the government? David Lipscomb's not necessarily concerned with that. He's concerned with, well, the church should not be involved in starting a civil war. Because, well, if you're going to force members of your congregation to start dividing themselves politically, well, then you're just going to start dividing, well, there's the Republican church and there's the Democrat church. And you have this church over here and that church over here. They're the ones who are supporting slavery. They're the ones who aren't supporting slavery. There's these guys who are over here who are indifferent. You have the guys over here. Well, David Lipscomb's saying, well, that would all happen if we infuse politics into our church. Sure, you could argue that. You could also argue not voting in politics makes you that's the crazy church over there who has no grasp on reality and what's going on in the world. And then you have us, the normal church that understands people are going to be, by nature, political animals because they're involved in communities, they have jobs, they have concerns of their own life. But this was going to be another discussion question, but probably the answer is no. Can the church truly remove itself from political and social debates? No. Because unless we are all moving off to a compound where we all just work with each other and nothing else happens in our world, we can never truly be separated.
The Amish.
Well, the Amish, but then you still have them helping people who break down on the side of the road in Pennsylvania. Like they're still engaging with the outside world. Like even the Mennonites who will show up, and we have a community to the south of us they're over there and they're like, we're not going to be involved. And then you go to Chick-fil-A and you see like half of them on one side of the restaurant. Well, how'd you get the money to pay Chick-fil-A? Well, it's because you had a job working for this guy who hired, so you're not truly separating yourself from the social issues. If you are struggling to get work because no one has the money to pay you to build their barn, well, you don't have the money, you're still tied to that system politically and socially. And then accelerate a couple years, and it really becomes an issue with World War I and World War II. You still have mandatory conscription. The Churches of Christ do take this more bold approach. There's a letter that's written on Harding the letterhead, from a church in Searcy that's basically saying, it's great, but I'm going to warn you, Department of Defense, or War Department at this time, if you draft any of our guys from our church, we are asking that you don't put them in combat situations, let them be medics, let them be support staff, whatever. They will not fight. Well, that is a bold stance, but Lipscomb, a Church of Christer in Tennessee, would say, you're not even supposed to write them a letter. If they draft you, don't show up. Well, at least these guys in Searcy are starting to say, maybe we shouldn't just become enemies of the United States government, but maybe there's still a way for us to somehow strike a compromise here. This was another discussion question, but there's some that I really want to get to, and so we're going to skip this one. But should Christians fight in wars? I felt like that would be a good conversation, but maybe another time. This one is a little bit more of a heavy moment. It's the Memphis sanitation strike. It's what kicks off the week, or not weeks, I guess 2 months could still be considered weeks. So the weeks leading up to MLK's assassination. What happens is in February of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, there's a storm and it floods a street. And since Memphis is still very much segregated, the white co-worker who's driving the garbage truck can sit in the cab, whereas the black workers, who would usually be the ones who had to go pick up the trash and throw it into the back, had to go try and take shelter in the back. They didn't think anything of it. This isn't an actual picture of the two guys who died, but you can see that clearly there's some pattern or some practice of, okay, they would have to sit on that part of the back. And so when it's raining, they're trying to get up in there. And what happens is Echo Cole and Robert Walker have to take shelter back there. They end up dying because of faulty equipment in the trunk, because the mechanism crushes them and they die. Now this happens a block away from the White Station Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. The only thing that's separating them now is a high school. So basically on the doorstep of a Church of Christ, you have this tragedy happen. And on one side you have these organizers who they coined the term, I am a man. You cannot look down on us. We are men too. But beyond that, they're being spurned on by workers' unions to get involved. They're being funded and to support this strike. There is violence in the streets because anytime you get any group of people a little upset or a little emotional, there's going to be damage. I think of the time when, or not the time, I guess it was only a couple years ago, 2019, Tech makes the Final Four, and what happens? A bunch of college students and people who are just really big fans of Texas Tech go out on the street, and there's property damage done. There's some might call it a riot. Some might say, oh, it was just a bunch of college kids and probably some drunks who got all riled up, and it just happens when people go out. Not really. That's not like Duke's not burning down half of Lubbock when they win the national championship, but they also have like 20 national championships. And so it's one of those, there's all this tension. They're blaming the mayor. The mayor was not a very popular guy. He barely won the election anyways. But they're blaming him because he passed along budget cuts. And they blame him for, if you didn't cut the budget, the maintenance budget would be higher, and there would not have been these technical difficulties with this truck. And so this is an overall breaking point. And this goes on for 2 months. And so I want us to spend some time discussing, how should the church respond to injustice? Or a better way of framing it, if this happened a block away from Greenlawn, what would our response be? I'm going to give you 5 minutes.
arrived in Babylon, it was his culture. He was told to go out and pray to God, but he didn't.
I'm sorry?
Because he was not going to do what man was. He was going to continue to obey God.
That's like seeing somebody that's dying on the side of the road and just pray.
Could happen.
They did the same thing. They let us eat the vegetables and stuff and see how.
Not a part.
See how we.
Not a part. We do, they should tell me.
I'm not able to keep up, you know, we can do what you're doing. They still.
But they didn't.
Not the texting. So this is talking about if you had a similar situation where somebody dies,
Jesus said, pay your taxes.
and in this case,
Pay your
racial.
taxes to Caesar.
What is our law? We know that we should be.
But the question being to be solved, of course, now that we know what God did.
We should be against injustice.
Yeah, and we run out there, solve it. You know, punish everything. We solve it.
God tells me justice is, what is the just thing to do? What is the just way to do? Treat each other and treat others. It's not
Another about how people are raised, right?
Yeah.
And the culture that they're in.
What is justice?
So we lived in eastern Tennessee years ago. And there, it was a different culture than what we have now.
Did deal with that.
And I heard the term for the first time when we moved there, the
He went to the
northern aggression.
And a lot of times we think it was the money situation.
And some people still have that.
It wasn't the money situation. Jesus had just got through
Or carry on from the Civil War.
fighting hunger.
That was a lot of but still,
The
research.
tree to turn to food, and it didn't, and he cursed it. So when he went to the temple, he was hungry. And when he got there, they weren't, the money changers wasn't the problem. The problem was that the church was making money from poor people who needed to be eaten to pay for it. And that's when he objected to that, because they should have been feeding the people. So then that's when he turned to him. And then the next step after that, guess who he goes to? He goes to Nicodemus, and what he tells him? Come, I'm going to your house. And what was he going to go do? So he was fighting a hunger deal like this. So many times I think in the church, especially from ministers, that take the thing that, because they're ministers, they shouldn't get involved in it. But that Jesus got involved in it, Paul got involved in it, the apostles got involved in it, they all died for it. So it was not that he was saying, you know,
Don't they have to come out?
I think going back to the question, if something happens, you know, we're taught to love our neighbors, and I think if that were to happen
So you're doing that.
near Greenlawn, I do think that we, as Christians, should
It's gotta be a solution.
respond to it. Yeah.
We are the church. We are the church.
All right, let's come back together. Let's hear from some different people this time about what you guys talked about.
I'd say yeah, I said, celebrate, but And then there's which side of injustice?
Mm.
Because it sounds like there's more than just one. I mean, injustice.
So wherever we do see injustice, we should have a voice. Someone has said we represent Christ. He didn't get into social issues that didn't matter, but things that did, that impacted people. He did. He had a concern for it and raised it. Did he care about the money? No. But how you take care of widows and orphans, yes, he did have something to say about that.
The greatest good for the greatest number of people, isn't it?
We kind of talked about that, like, we have the resources and the responsibility to not, like, obviously not participate in outrage and riots and things like that, but community outreach, counseling, reaching out to families impacted by that. Like, we talked about that specific example in the sixties, like, chances are those guys had families and they were the breadwinners for their family, like, what happens to their families after that, so.
I believe in being kind to anybody needs help. I will do my best to help, or out of my resources, like she said. I do what I can with what I have, if not, I find some way. And I'm working on my neighbors.
Yes.
Care for my neighbors.
Surely we don't just, we're not doing it because we're representing the church per se. We're doing things as individuals in our lives because we're Christians and that's how God tells us to behave. But to say, well, now Greenlawn is going to stand up for such and such, no, I don't think we can do that.
Jesus did deal with injustices when he came to the temple. Remember, he had just got through fighting hunger. He cursed the tree for it did not give fruit on it. So when he came to the temple, guess what? He was hungry. He walks into the temple, and guess what they're doing? They're making money off the poor people who they needed to be feeding, and they're making money, and that's what upset him. So he started that problem there. Because then afterwards, did he get fed? Well, he was also thinking of spiritual feeding, because he goes to Nicodemus, and what did he ask Nicodemus? Come from going to your house. And what did he go? To go eat. So he did fight that. And then you had Paul also fought a little personal injustice that was given to him, that he went in to fight for his freedom on it. So it wasn't that God didn't say that, but at that time, when he first brought this idea that we were supposed to separate ourselves from the church, but then he also didn't he completely exclude us from the government, that we still had a responsibility there. But then things were going to be changing as time went by. But he had purpose at that point, and then we have purposes at different points that we have to be prepared to deal with it. Because what's right after the church, I mean, he established the church and everything. Guess what? They went into where they were completely in exile. And what happened during that exile, things like this were completely distorted. The word of God was distorted. They weren't going by what the word had. They had developed their own way of thinking, and I think that God had a purpose for these things to happen. And every 10, 20 years, you have a change in the church of philosophy, thinking, way of thinking and dealing with it.
Sure. You've all made very good points. Just a few more slides on my end. So this sanitation strike, it kind of reaches ahead in April. of 1968, and that's after 2 full months of striking going on. Martin Luther King makes his appearance. He comes into Memphis and he gives the "I have been to the mountaintop" speech. It's, of course, the last speech he'll give. I did think of trying to play it for us this evening, but we simply do not have time. In reality, if we wanted to listen to the whole speech, that would have been all of class, and then we would have had like 15 minutes to talk about it. But what happens is the very next day, after spending a day going out into the community in Memphis, he's coming back to his motel room, and he's telling the story is he's talking to the guys with him. He's trying to get them ready for yet another service, because what Martin Luther King Jr. liked to do was he would hold a church service, and then he would have a speech that would be an hour long, and some of it would be your traditional sermon, and some of it would be very much a speech like a politician would give. And he's giving notes of, hey, what if we sung this song tonight? And around 6 p.m. he is shot, and later the shooter is arrested, trying to flee from the United States in London. I did have a last question. This leads to national riots. This is a picture of stores and apartment buildings that have been burned down in Washington, D.C. This had far-reaching impacts. Something that happened in Tennessee was causing riots and burning of buildings, not only in the nation's capital, but in major cities and all across the country. So, not only are we having churches in Memphis have to respond to this, what do these churches in these rioting areas respond? And I wanted to ask us the question, how should this church respond to political violence? However, we have 2 minutes, and there is no easy way to answer that question other than we probably should not be involved in it. Not probably, we should not be involved in political violence.
Correct.
And we should not support political violence.
A police officer told me, Mary, let the police take the matter in their hands.
Yes.
No.
Anyway, next week, and this may just be, I'm going to turn next week into a soapbox. I haven't quite decided yet, but I'm tired of hearing the phrase unprecedented times. And I'm sure some of you are also tired of hearing that phrase. And so next week we're going to kind of talk about, are we really in unprecedented times, or are we just losing our memories altogether? So that's where we'll be next week. Thank you guys for being here.